So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live and online program here in the new Book Club quarters at 47 Kearney. Big round of applause for that. Thank you for joining us. The title of our program this evening is American Burial Ground, A New History of the Overland Trail. And again, thank you for joining us. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the executive director for the book club. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all and kind of host this event tonight. For those of you that might be new to the Book Club of California, we are a nonprofit member and donor supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes we do that with a focus on the history and the literature of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition, finely made books. We have a scholarly journal called the Quarterly Newsletter, and we produce keepsakes for our members. We also host a year-round series of programs, exhibitions, and talks like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, California history, and much, much more. Now, if you're not a member of the book club, you probably should be. Or if your membership has lapsed, you should renew it. Or if you're just interested in what we do, I want you to consider joining or rejoining our century-long tradition by becoming a member. Our membership dues are modest, but the benefits are many, and we simply can't do the work of the book club without the support of our members. So I encourage you to go online to bccbooks.org to join, to donate, or to find out more about us. Okay, now for tonight's program and our presenter. The program is titled American Burial Ground, A New History of the Overland Trail by author, historian, and assistant professor of history at the University of Nevada, Reno, Sarah Keyes. Now, Sarah Keyes is a historian of the United States who specializes in 19th century and the history of the U.S. West, with a focus on the environmental and intercultural interactions between Indigenous peoples and Euro-Americans. Her current work explores these topics along the Overland Trails to Oregon and California in the mid-19th century. Her first book, this book right here, American Burial Ground, A New History of the Overland Trail, was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in October 2023. Sarah has also begun work on her second project. Is that true?
It's true.
It's true. You're a glutton for punishment. On to the next book, a regional and transnational study of suffrage in the U.S. West, for which she was recently awarded a Mellon Schlesinger Summer Research Grant from the Schlesinger Library at Harvard University. Sarah received her BA from Pomona College and her PhD from the University of Southern California. As I said earlier, she is the assistant professor in the Department of History at the University of Nevada, Reno. And tonight, Sarah will talk about American Burial Ground, her book. In popular mythology, the Overland Trail is typically a triumphant tale, right? With plucky Easterners crossing the plains in caravans or covered wagons. But not everyone reached Oregon and California. Some 6,600 migrants perished along the way and were buried where they fell, often on Indigenous land. Their graves ultimately became the seeds of U.S. expansion. In placing death at the center of the history of the Overland Trail, American Burial Ground, and our author offers a sweeping and long overdue reinterpretation of this historic milestone. Now, in terms of logistics, we will have a presentation, an illustrated presentation, which you can see on Zoom and here in the club rooms. And then we will open up for questions and comments. If you're on Zoom, you can use the chat and the Q&A functions. We should be able to curate those questions and comments for our Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Of course, we'll take questions from you here in the audience as well. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Sarah Keyes. Advance.
Okay,
Here, do that. And now you should be able to advance.
perfect. Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Kevin, and for organizing tonight. I'm really happy to be here and really grateful for all of you for coming out both in person and virtually. I grew up on the peninsula, so it's really wonderful to be in San Francisco to talk about my book. Now, many of you are likely familiar with the history of the Overland Trail or trails. White people moving westward in white top covered wagons were cinematic icons of the mid 20th century. They were then remade into new pixelated green and black icons in the late 20th century with the computer game, the Oregon Trail, which was a mainstay of my own childhood. Now, that game tasks players with evading death to make it to Oregon alive. Get dysentery, drown in a river, and it's game over. No Oregon for you, and you had to start over with a new team heading west. Now, I had this narrative in mind. How could I not? Having lost the game more times than I could count, when I started working on this book project. But as I delved deep into trail documents and looked far and wide through sources that captured the meaning of the trail, newspapers, tourist guidebooks, railroad publications, monuments, and later in the 20th century movies, I found something else, that it wasn't game over for those who died. Instead, the deaths along the way changed the experience and the meaning of the trail for travelers and Americans at large, and that ultimately these dead immigrants helped to advance westward expansion. This doesn't mean that these deaths, those 6,600 deaths, weren't a loss, that they didn't mark failures. Dying anywhere is sad. Dying while migrating is a particular tragedy. And it's one that we still see today around the world. We see it at the US-Mexico border. We see it for migrants who are trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea. It's a loss. But on the trail, the failed dead immigrants will also ultimately become something else. Because of the specific context of 19th century white Protestant culture, and because of the political urge, even the demand in the 19th century United States for expansion. And I share this image here to give you a sense of the work of death on the Overland Trail. This is a drawing by cartographer and draftsman Joseph J. Goldsboro Bruff. Some of you may be familiar with him, and he becomes one of the most well-known recorders of graves along the Overland Trail. And this sketch, Immigrant's Burial, shows Bruff's mail mining company burying and marking the grave of Charles Bishop. Now, one of the conceits of commentators and immigrants in the 19th century was that men would not be good caretakers on the trail, that they wouldn't nurse you when you were sick, and they certainly wouldn't give you a proper burial if you died. And that's just not true. And we see in images like this one, we see in letters and diaries time and time again, men taking on these roles when they need to, these roles of caregiving on the migration. And we see it here as well with the care for Bishop's body. And I'd like to take just a moment here to define Overland Trail and to explain why I use that term in my book, because I imagine many of you have heard of the Oregon Trail, the California Trail, the Pony Express Trail, which largely parallels the California Trail. And you might also be aware, but maybe less familiar with the multiplicity of routes across the continent, the Cherokee Trail through Colorado, the Santa Fe Trail, other Southern trails. The point is, there's a lot of them. There's a lot of trails. But I'm less interested in parsing these multiple migratory pathways across the continent and more interested in understanding the experiences of the people who took them and the meanings they gave both to the landscape and to their journeys. We're all in San Francisco. We know there's something special about being on the Pacific. Those people in the 19th century knew it too. And that links these pathways together. So they're linked in people's minds to the same monumental transcontinental migration. And as I argue in the book, the shared trials and tragedies of these trails also helps to link them, and in many ways the entirety of the West, together as a landscape of white American suffering and sacrifice. So what I found as I did my research is that suffering and sacrifice is at the center of the experience and the cultural narrative of this migration. But popular mythology has typically depicted this mid-19th century overland migration as a caravan of covered wagons transporting men, women, and children across the sunny plains. It's triumphal, heroic, and a peaceful story of hardy immigrants surmounting obstacles like the mountain depicted here to reach the fertile lands of Oregon and the golden lands of California. And I love this painting by Emanuel Leutze. I don't know if anyone's seen it in person. It still hangs in the US Capitol building today. And Leutze was a historical narrative painter. He also famously painted Washington crossing the Delaware. And then about 10 years later, in 1862, the Union government commissioned him to paint a picture of westward expansion while they were renovating the Capitol building during the Civil War. And this specific scene is likely a depiction of South Pass in Wyoming, showing immigrants triumphing westward over the Rocky Mountains. And there's a lot we could discuss about this painting. Maybe we'll return to it in the Q&A. But right now, I just want to draw your attention to this sort of shadowy area against the rock, because there's something missing from this final painting that was there in the original mural study. I don't know if anyone knows what we might find there. What'd you say? Yes. Yes. Can you see it?
Yeah, I could.
Okay. So here we're looking here is a burial, and we're going to go in even a little bit closer. This isn't in the mural study. It doesn't make it in the final painting. What we're looking at here in this piece of the mural study is not triumph, but suffering and sacrifice. The pain of burial, the work of death, much like that which Bruff recorded in his sketch. And so my point is that while the Union government had a vested interest in depicting westward migration as a triumph during the Civil War, a great, wonderful story for the nation dealing with the ravages of death from this unprecedented conflict that's torn them asunder, that Leutze, like immigrants at the time, also recognized the tragedy of the Overland Trail. And we get an even better sense of what the string of burials along the trail look like by returning to Bruff's sketch. Because Bruff's depiction tells us even more about the process of burial. We have not only a shrouded corpse, but a well-organized funeral procession. We have a grave that's not simply along the trail, but has been picked out to be on a rise so that others can see it, they can visit, they can remember and pay their respects when they follow. We also have an inset here, because even though Bruff's titled this the immigrant's grave, suggesting anonymity, we have an individual. We have Charles Bishop, who was just 25 years old when he died of cholera on the trail. So we have a lot of detail here about the personal experiences of those who died and were buried along the way. And Charles Bishop is unique because we have this record of his death and his burial, but he's also very much falls in line with others who died along the trail. Because in the early 1850s, you have a series of cholera epidemics along the trails that claims the most lives of immigrants. And so Charles Bishop falls neatly into that. And he's of Washington City, Washington, D.C. That's where Bruff's company organized and from where they left. So one of the things that differentiates graves on the trail from graves in cemeteries in the United States is that they always have place of origin. So it might just say Iowa, or it might say a specific city, but they're always saying where the people are from. If you're buried at home, like most people were in the 19th century, you don't need that because you're buried where you lived. But on the trail, they have to specify. And so what you get is you get this great sort of regional diversity of white Americans who are buried along this trail. And that does something different for people too, especially when they're like increasingly approaching the Civil War, to see people from North and South, to see people from these far-flung parts of the United States buried next to each other. So that's something that's distinct there. Now, in looking at death on the trail, I'm really looking at it because it's so central to the human experience, but it does also take this sort of darker portrait of westward expansion by focusing on those who died along the way. I also think it gets us closer to understanding the trail than perhaps ever before. And I think it does so not just because it better captures the immigrant experience, but because it helps to connect that experience of expansion to the native experience of dispossession. So how I see it, the greatest cultural significance of the immigrant dead is that they helped the United States lay claim to land that was inhabited by Indigenous peoples. So where Charles Bishop is becomes a spot, a node of US belonging, that's been made sacred for white Americans because his body is there. And many of you are likely familiar with the process of dispossession in US history, the broken treaties, the wars that undergirded US expansion to the Pacific. We have a visual representation here. This map comes from a digital project by the historian Claudio Sant, and it depicts the status of native land possession in January of 1850. So this is about 6 months after Charles Bishop was buried. And Bishop was buried between Scotts Bluff and Fort Laramie, so he's somewhere in the blue here. He's in native homeland. And this also just shows you the sheer amount of land that's native held in 1850. And this is the state of dispossession in January 1893, some 40 years later. And the burial of Bishop's corpse in native land and the burial of thousands of other immigrants in the lands of Lakota, Shoshone, Northern Paiute, Southern Paiute, and other native polities through whose lands the trail cut is an understudied part of this thread. The act of inserting immigrant corpses, such as Bishop's, into sovereign Indigenous soil had far-reaching consequences for US history generally and the history of the trail specifically. And those far-reaching consequences stretched beyond the role of dead immigrants in dispossession to actually include the importance of Indigenous defense of their homelands to shaping trail history. And this fact surprised me. So when I went out to try to say something new about the trail, I thought I need to do a better job of acknowledging its links to dispossession. But then as I did research, I realized that in many ways, the conversation about the meaning of the trail, the experience of dying on migration routes was something that had already been written from the Indigenous perspective. And so this provides a frame, it shapes the voluntary westward migration that we're perhaps more familiar with. I did not expect to find this. In part, I didn't expect to find this because Native voices and perspectives are scarce in the immigrant archive, and the thousands of trail letters, diaries, and memoirs that can be found in libraries or also in personal collections. But that doesn't mean Native peoples weren't important to trail history. They absolutely were. And one of the ways they were important is how they talked about their dead and their graves to resist dispossession and to describe their suffering and sacrifice during forced removals west. So this painting here depicts one of the best known of these forced removal routes, the Cherokee Trail of Tears. But this Trail of Tears was also a trail of graves. The second image on this slide is of a letter that Cherokee woman Eliza Jane Ross wrote to her uncle John Ross in 1842, a few years after the Trail of Tears. In the letter, Eliza tells John, who served as Cherokee principal chief, essentially the president, she tells him about the dead along the trail. And she's writing here to blame members of the Treaty Party, a faction of the Cherokee Nation that agreed to removal. And Eliza is saying that as a result of this agreement, they have, quote, seen the graves of their own people strewn many hundreds of miles along the roads and banks of the rivers in strange lands and amongst strangers, without one friend to watch over their bones. So this, in Eliza's telling, is the suffering of the Trail of Graves. And Eliza's words are, in fact, just one of many examples of Native peoples describing their forced removal routes as marked by graves as well as tears. And they're doing so to document their suffering, the trauma of dispossession, and also an attempt to better Native relations with the United States. And another key feature of the fight against dispossession that I trace in chapter 1 of the book is the ways in which Indigenous people safeguarded and marked their ancestors' graves before they were forced from their homelands. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the talk. But why this perspective and this material come at the beginning of the book, it's sort of the frame for the start of the voluntary westward migration. It's the last chapter I wrote, and it's the one that took me the longest to figure out. Because as I mentioned, this project started from a dramatically different place. So in the rest of the talk that follows, I'd like to take you chronologically, but I'm going to take you chronologically through my process rather than through my argument. There are really sort of three eras that shaped my research. The first that led me to see the Overland Trail as a viable research topic. The second, when I got into the sources and began to see immigrants placing death at the center. And then the third and final period in which I came to articulate the ways Native people shaped the history of the Overland Trail. And so I'll close with that final and key component, as well as some proposals for where we might go from here with trail memory and memorialization. So how did I decide that the Overland Trail was a viable research topic? Part of it had to do with how I asked different questions than those previous historians had asked, because I was really interested in trying to understand three things. Why does the Overland Trail continue to play such a prominent role in popular memory? And then the flip side of that being, why had academics largely abandoned trail history? And would it be possible to say something new about this experience? And not only something new, but something that sort of contributed to the field of Western history. And the origins of these questions really came from two central experiences. And the first for me was this one right here. And this is Fort Casper in Casper, Wyoming. I don't know if anyone's been there. Have you? Oh, that's fantastic. Okay, so it's a Civil War era fort. It's also a Platte River crossing for folks on the Overland Trail. And I was lucky enough to get an internship there soon after college. So I spent the summer there. I was mostly outside, which on the plains in the summer is kind of a mixed bag, as answering visitor questions, leading tours. And through meeting and talking with visitors, I got a sense of the passion and the knowledge that many hold for the trail. And that was really interesting to me. What was most interesting to them was actually my name, Sarah Kais, because it's the same name as the first member of the Donner Party who died. So there were some requests for photo ops. I obliged.
Any relation?
Not that I know of. And we all wish for some claim to fame, I guess. And this, at least in trails world, was mine. And so even from the beginning of my exposure to trail history and memory, evidence is pointing me towards the prominence of death and dying in the trail experience. The other major place where I saw the Oregon Trail and popular culture also pointed to this. I mentioned playing the game very poorly. And then we can not only play the game now, we can also buy t-shirts with the tagline, "You have died of dysentery." So there you go. Widely available. I don't sell them though. So these are my ideas. Okay, this is going to be a great topic. No one's done it. People are excited about it. I want to say something new about it. And then I got into the sources, and we're at the book club of California, right? Like you all understand the importance of books and sources. I saw Hutchings' Yosemite tourist guide out there. And there is just a depth and richness to trail sources that is really unparalleled. And you can find them everywhere. They're in large archives like the Newberry. They're in smaller ones like the California Historical Society, where I've also had the privilege of doing research. They can be found as standalone documents, like John C. Anderson's diary, which is in special collections at Utah State. They're also part of larger personal and familial collections. This is a snapshot from the Shaw Webb papers at the American Antiquarian Society in Massachusetts. And I even found some accounts embedded in pension claims filed with the federal government. This last snap is of a microfilmed card with the paging information for the pension file of Edward J. Bartholomew. Bartholomew served in the Civil War, but he was also part of the ill-fated Jayhawker party that got lost in the Mojave Desert on the way to California. So cholera, getting lost, drowning in rivers, firearm accidents, these are all things that contribute to deaths on the trail. And Bartholomew's file, one of the letters is from his trail companion, John B. Colton, who was one of the youngest members of the party, but in the years following the Jayhawker disaster, sort of took the lead in promoting their tragedy and suffering. So we have an account there as well. And there's also others that are still out there. But these are really rich sources. And in reading through them, I was really struck by the words of Dale L. Morgan, who worked for many years at the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley. And Morgan has called these accounts, quote, "a mosaic in words." And they really are. They're a mosaic of the personal experiences of the hundreds of thousands of immigrants who pinned their hopes and set their sights on reaching the Pacific. And I really like Morgan's phrasing here because it gives credit to the immigrant writers, some of whom really struggled to put pen to paper in more ways than one. Exhaustion, limited sort of mastery of the written language, but still they were driven to write, they were driven to record because this migration meant so much to them, and they shared their experiences with the world. And as I read through these accounts, I was struck by their humanity, and I also kept stumbling upon their attention to death. There was Silas Newcomb, an immigrant from Wisconsin who visited his mother's grave to say goodbye before heading overland to seek his fortune in the California goldfields. There was Abigail Scott Dunaway, who described her family's efforts to bury her mother in painstaking detail, including how, as we saw with Charles Bishop, they selected a spot on a rise that was both beatific and prominent, a place that could be remembered. Or Vincent Hoover, who when he and his parents left his younger brother John's body behind on the trail, consoled themselves with the thought that by placing John so close to the Platte River, he would find companionship in the sounds of the water. And then there was Sarah Nichols, who as her husband and son took to the California Trail during a cholera epidemic, begged them to return, begged them to save their lives, and as she wrote them, her own. But they continued on, leaving her warnings unheeded, until her son Samuel died of cholera on a steamboat headed up the Missouri River to one of the jumping off towns, the name for the starting points on the eastern edge of the trail. Ultimately, Sarah's loss was mitigated in a way that most losses on the trail weren't. Her husband George brought her son Samuel's body home. Now, this was no easy feat in 1849. But George paid for a special double-lined coffin that was designed to preserve the body. He also paid for freight transport on steamboats to take this very heavy coffin, and he brought their son's body home to New York. Sarah was advised by her reverend not to open the coffin.
Yeah.
She did not, but she buried it close to her house, and she had it there for the rest of her life. And so as I let my sources take the lead, I turned an empathetic eye to their accounts. I began to see how central death and dying was to the immigrant experience. And it remains very central to trail memory as well. This picture here is of a marker that was placed by the Oregon-California Trails Association in 2015. And it's actually a marker that was placed to honor Abigail Scott Dunaway's mother. She had been lost. She'd been taken to the University of Wyoming for study and then was returned, reburied. And Octa members, including Randy Brown, placed the marker there, and this was just in 2015. So death matters on the trail. And then as I zoomed out from the trail to the larger context of death and culture in 19th century America, I found that, of course, it made perfect sense that it would be. In the mid-19th century, pre-antibiotic United States, death was everywhere. It was omnipresent in a way that it isn't in 21st century America, not to discount there are many tragedies, including the tragedies of the COVID-19 pandemic. And one way to grasp this omnipresence of death is to grasp variations on one of the most common phrases of 19th century America, if I live. This phrase was something 19th century Americans might say to a conversation partner quite casually when talking about future plans. And it was certainly a phrase that appeared in many 19th century letters, the most important medium of communication at the time. Here's just one example of a use of this phrase. When John Minto, who's circled in red here, and he eventually immigrates overland to Oregon in 1844, so he comes in one of the first wagon trains to go to Oregon. And then in 1901, he's interviewed by historian H.S. Lyman, and he gives his reminiscences about his trip. And Minto tells Lyman, you know, the way my journey started is that I was sitting with my family at Christmas dinner, and I just told them, if I live, I will go across the Rocky Mountains. That's a really good example of the use of the phrase. And Minto was pretty exceptional for his time. He actually lived until 1915.
Wow.
He dies at the age of 92.
Gee.
But that's unheard of, right? And in fact, people born in the 1820s and 1830s, so this is sort of the decades of birth of many overland immigrants, they have some of the lowest life expectancies of the entire 19th century. Because the United States is becoming slightly more urban over the course of the 19th century, but sort of public health infrastructure, sanitation is not keeping up with that. So that is contributing to rising mortality rates. So Americans in the 19th century were powerless to prevent death, but they could, and they did, choreograph their responses to it. They gathered to listen to their loved ones' dying moral instructions, and they dutifully narrated the scene for distant friends and relatives. With the soul gone, the body became the focus of memorialization. White Americans laid their loved ones out, they wrapped them in shrouds, they buried them close to home, and they waited for the day they would be reunited in heaven. As they had cared for their dead, anticipative survivors cared for their connection with their deceased loved ones. They fingered locks of hair, they gazed on miniature portraits, and most importantly, they visited their graves. Graves were seen as portals between the dead and the living, and tranquil beatific places for the living to commune with the dead. And this is an embroidered mourning picture from around 1810, and it captures this role of the grave. So we have a use of the urn and the willow motif in this mourning art. And so the willow symbolizes grief and mourning. The urn stands in as a symbol for the corpses that are in the tomb. And it's a move away from these sort of skull and bone symbols that were used earlier in the time period that made death seem scary and disintegrating, and more as a sort of peaceful, beatific symbol of the dead that were lying there. And I'm not sure how familiar you all may be with this type of embroidery work and art, but they're absolutely gorgeous. They're very skillfully done. And they could be done both by women and young girls who are trained to do this type of work in school as well.
Excuse me, are those women wearing mourning clothes, they're not in mourning clothes. I mean, mourning.
That's correct. They aren't.
They are.
They aren't. That's correct. Yes, that's true. Oh, these are really good observations, because going to the cemetery is an event, and you want to go and be respectful, and perhaps your period of mourning has ended, but you will still go. And it will be an important occasion. Yeah, absolutely. That's a wonderful observation. And so it's the grave to which mourners form specific attachments. It's the reason why Sarah Nichols was in such despair that her husband and son might die on the journey. It's also the reason why Margaret White Chambers, who traveled to Oregon 7 years after John Minto did, described the fear of leaving a loved one behind on the trail as, quote, perfectly agonizing. Now, in this earlier image from Bruff, we saw a good depiction of how people buried their dead on the trail. And this image, Bruff has captured the fear and concern of what would happen to what was left behind. And so if you can imagine sort of wilderness threats of the mid-19th century, all of them are here, right? You've got the vulture, you've got the wolves, you've got the bear with extraordinary long claws waiting his turn. The message is that your dead are not safe. Their physical remains are not safe. Even their memory is not safe. You have scratches on the tombstone, right? So the idea that bodies might be dislocated, they might be lost forever, it's absolutely horrifying. It also sort of lays the idea that along the entire trail, there could be a dead emigrant. So the sort of idea that they might be both sort of everywhere and nowhere at the same time helps to make the West seem this sort of sacred space for those who come in after. And later settlers will actually spend a lot of time searching for and identifying these graves as they move into places like Nebraska, where Charles Bishop was buried. And this concern of what would happen to the dead who were left behind was not new in the 1850s and late 1840s. We already saw it, for example, noted by Eliza Jane Ross in 1842. And so here I'm going to move into the third and final section of my process, where I talk about forging the connection between Overland Trail history and Native history. So Eliza's words are telling and evocative. They weren't the first piece of evidence that made me begin to investigate the connection between forced removals, or as historian Claudio Sant calls them, deportations of Indigenous peoples, and how those connected to the voluntary migration of immigrants across the Overland Trail. Those words actually came from someone else, someone who used his power to become one of the direct causal forces of Indigenous removal, President Andrew Jackson. Now, in the period where I was working to understand immigrant descriptions of the emotional toll of leaving home and their dead behind, I read a book by a historian named Susan Matt. And Susan Matt wrote this really great book about homesickness in US history. It's a wide-ranging book. She talks about a lot of different populations. And she makes this argument, the idea that Americans were always mobile and on the move and ready for a new opportunity, that is not right. That Americans, of course, they were connected to home and place. And so she explores the toll of leaving home behind. And in the book, she also included an excerpt from a speech that Andrew Jackson made to Congress in 1830. So Jackson had become president in 1828. This is actually the same year that Eliza's uncle, John Ross, became the principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. And Jackson was a man whose moment of fame during the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812 became a platform from which he launched a political career. He was riddled with old bullet wounds and at least one bullet. He was plagued by chronic digestive issues. He was also the face of an increasingly sort of hardline belief in racial difference. And he was also the face of really the pro-removal campaign. Now, in this quote, which comes from a second annual message to Congress in December 1830, Jackson lays out his vision of removal as one that was necessary and little different than voluntary white westward migration. As he puts it, it'll be painful for Native peoples to leave the graves of their fathers, but what do you do? We've done the same thing. We've also left home and earthly objects behind to find something new, to find something better. And when I first read this excerpt, I thought, why would Jackson be talking about the Indigenous pain of removal from the graves of their fathers? And how did he come to need to refer to this in his speeches? Jackson is not known for having sympathy for Native pain, but some representatives in Congress did. So Jackson's Removal Act had passed earlier in the year of 1830 at the end of May, but it had barely passed. There was a sustained campaign against it with white allies and Native peoples fighting it. And so in this report, Jackson is telling Congress how removal is going. And he's also, it seems to me, trying to mitigate Native pain by comparing it to voluntary westward movement. And with this quote in mind, I looked more widely in primary sources and secondary sources documenting the language of the anti-removal campaign, the language of Native peoples and whites who resisted the Removal Act. And what I came to realize is that Jackson is talking about graves of our fathers. He's talking about Native connection to homeland. He's comparing it to the pain of white separation because that was a central thread of the campaign against removal. These are just a few examples of how this figures in the campaign against removal. This one here comes from the Sauk people during the Black Hawk War in Illinois, saying, "We refuse to leave. This land contains the bones of our ancestors. Of course, we will defend it as long as we live." This one comes from John Ross himself from a letter he wrote in 1836, telling white people, "Is it true you will drive us from the tombs of our fathers and of our mothers?" This third one is from 1832. This was actually written by William Lloyd Garrison, one of the most prominent advocates of abolition. He also allied with African Americans to argue against the possibility of their removal to Liberia after emancipation. And here he's saying, hey, African Americans are as against removal from the United States as the Cherokee are from removing from the graves of their fathers. This fourth instance is interesting because we do have forced removal in the United States. Historians are also beginning to do more to uncover folks who were able to evade that removal, either through getting special dispensation from the government or through hiding out. This Creek man is doing the latter. He's hiding out. He's discovered and he says, "Please don't reveal my hiding place. I do not want to be removed from the bones of my ancestors." So this is everywhere. In newspapers, it's in political petitions. This is a language and conversation that's been going on for decades before white immigrants step out on the trail to Oregon and California, and it's being used to resist dispossession. And removal did happen tragically for many Native peoples, but that doesn't mean that they give up. It doesn't mean that they say, okay, now our connection with our land is severed. It's absolutely the opposite. So on the eve of forced removal, for instance, a Choctaw man, George H. Harkins, pens and publishes what he titles A Farewell to the American People in Niles Weekly. And he says, even as we're leaving, even as you're forcing us to leave, this is the land of our ancestors. These are their bones. You have another man who opposes forced removal on the eve of it happening to the Creeks. This is written by Creek Principal Chief Yaholo in 1835. And he says, in taking our land, you're not only taking our land, you are taking our dead. You're stealing our dead. And so he's telling the US officials that they're basically grave robbers, which in the 19th century is one of the worst things you can be. The sanctity of the dead, the sanctity of trying to preserve the corpse is absolutely top. So people for medical research are taking bones in the dead of night because they don't want to be identified as doing this. And Yaholo is telling them, no, you are that bad. That's what you are doing. And they don't only use words, they also mark and defend their graves. So this is an example of a stone marker that was erected in a cemetery that's now part of Kansas City by Native people. And then finally, I have pictures of some dirt here, because in one instance, the Miami, when they're forced to leave Ohio, what they do is they go to say goodbye to their graves. They take some clods of dirt or small stones with them as a memory, right? Because graves are really all about remembering those who lie in these particular places. So they keep these connections to home. And then they're forced on these removal routes, which are much more geographically varied and much more demographically varied in terms of the Native peoples who are forced on them than just the Cherokee Trail of Tears. Because these deportations are creating westward trails that are coming from north and south, and then they're pushing westward close to the edge of the Overland Trail. And just as will happen on the voluntary white westward migration of the trails, you also have cholera on these routes. So you also have people dying along the way from this very deadly, very scary disease. Very scary really for two reasons. Because it can kill people so quickly, because it dehydrates them so rapidly, and because the symptoms are so horrifically nasty. Because you're quickly dehydrated. One of the scariest things about cholera is that you can look like a corpse before you're even dead. You can be completely immobilized. Some people even turn blue because they've lost so much fluid. And so cholera ravages Native peoples on the trails as well. In one instance, a detachment of Cherokee are being forced to remove in 1834 are completely hit with cholera. And one of the whites who's transporting them on the removal route, records, in the space of 2 days, Black Fox lost his wife and 3 children. Will Tucker lost 4 sons. The very vehicles tasked with transporting Native peoples west also contributed to these deaths. Wagons, in the words of sympathetic Potawatomi missionary Benjamin Marie Petit, turned the journey into a veritable torture. White top covered wagons became wheeled death chambers. When people became too sick to walk or ride, conductors loaded them into wagon beds, crowded with other sick people and frequently luggage. And then they went on. There are instances where Native peoples are able to pause the migration. There's an example of a group of Cherokee who forced the conductors to pause the train so that they can bury the daughter of one of their leaders who has died. So they stay put and they bury her the best they can. But eventually they force them to move on and they set up new communities to the west. So for some time, historians have sort of thought about the removal era and the Overland Trail as 2 different pieces of US history. But they're also beginning to see them as inextricably linked events, and I certainly fall in this vein. And there's a distinguished historian of the American West, you may be familiar, Elliott West, and as he put it, removal and the trail were sort of twin migrations. And by training the spotlight on death, it provides another way to connect these 2 historic touchstones. What became the central plot of the Overland Trail and its role in national expansion, risking death on the way, dying in unsettled country, and being buried far from home and family, had already been established as the central plot of the removal era. But these similar plots were turned to distinct ends. Indigenous peoples lived, narrated, and memorialized their experience of death in opposition to, rather than in concert with, US settler colonialism. In articulating their attachment to their homelands in terms of their sacred and emotional ties to the graves of their fathers, Indigenous peoples broadcast a particular form of placemaking that also became the metric against which their opponents measured white attachment to home. So by the time white Americans begin to create landmarks of death on the Overland Trail, like Charles Bishop's grave, they did so in a context defined by Indigenous activism against removal. So voluntary westward expansion, the contingencies of dying on the Overland Trail, comes out of this context of this decades-long cross-cultural conversation about death, graves, and territorial claims. And so I want to end this evening with a call concerning the future of placemaking on the Overland Trail. As of now, most sites and monuments continue to foreground and center the immigrant experience. One prominent example is the Donner Monument, also called the Pioneer Monument, which sits high in the Sierra, near where the ill-fated Donner Party camped, starved, and ate the dead during the winter of 1846 to 1847. In the spring and summer, warming sun heats the bronze figures at the top of the pedestal. With a snap of fall, chilly breezes begin to hint of imminent snowfall. Winter storms dust and shroud the Pioneer family in snow, but the snowpack doesn't reach the top of the 22-foot rock and stone pedestal built to commemorate the level of snow in 1846 and 47. When the Native Sons sponsored the monument more than 100 years ago, they envisioned it as a tribute to the triumph of stalwart immigrants who followed the suffering Donners to California. Today, the Pioneer Monument is a signal of how far we still must travel. Placemaking along the Overland Trail and the use of death and graves to mark white suffering and sacrifice was part of a larger project of white efforts to dispossess Native peoples, to claim their homelands as their own. The Donner Monument is one example of this placemaking, but there are thousands of others across the West. It is now time to contribute to ongoing efforts to recenter Native peoples in the history of the US, the West, and the Overland Trail. Throughout most of the 20th century, remembering the Overland Trail as an immigrant burial ground furthered the goal of solidifying US possession. But there are other ways to remember, ways that bring us closer to the past, while also drawing the trail into the present and future. Thank you.
Take another drink of that water.
Okay.
No rush.
You guys were such a good audience. That went so fast.
I'm gonna come over here and share this little screen with you so people can see us.
Oh,
So another scene. Oh, okay. That's okay. You don't really need to see me. So we're good. We have time to take some questions from the audience, so we'll start in the back. Matt?
Actually, two. First, was there anything noteworthy one way or the other about the immigration of the Mormons on the Mormon Trail along these lines? Or is it the same story with a different religion?
Yeah, that's such a great question. It's a really fantastic
Can you
question.
repeat the question for me?
Oh, yeah.
That'd be great.
Oh, yeah. The question was, is there anything sort of distinct about the Mormon Trail and the Mormon immigrant experience, or does it sort of fit into the story I told you? And that's a really great question. And I would say in general, it's very similar. I really focus in my book on 19th century white Protestants who are headed, to Oregon and California. But there is certainly a lot of similarity with the LDS experience, and also the focus on memory and memorialization of the dead. And that would be a great book to write.
Go here in the front and then.
And
over here.
second question.
Oh,
And second, just, were you aware that there was a huge, massive relocation of the dead in San Francisco?
Yes, I don't know all the specifics of it, but those relocations happened in a number of urban settings as cities grew and they had to figure out what to do. And that's one of the reasons why cemeteries change in this 19th century period, is there's this attempt to get them out of cities, have more space, and to protect them so that doesn't have to happen. But yeah, it still does happen for sure.
My father's friend used to accuse him of having his grandmother in the basement because that was if the Laurel was on top of what used to be the Laurel Hill Cemetery.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's such a good example of how the dead make space and how they claim it. Yeah, for sure.
Here in the front now.
On the way, you run across extended Duncan. As somebody
Yes.
said to you, from there, it is going to be 3 weeks to California. In other words, where the landmarks say you have accomplished this much at this point when you reach this. Did anybody use them as that kind of a marker?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So
Repeat the question.
oh yeah, thank you. So the question is, did anybody use graves as a marker, like a landmark, and it'll be like 3 more weeks to get to California, like Lucinda Duncan's
Yeah.
grave, which is in eastern Nevada? Absolutely. There's some people who write home in the period of the peak of deaths along the trail, so 1849 to early 1850s, when there's a lot of cholera, and they literally say, you know, my map was no good, but I knew I was on the right road because I saw graves as I went along the way.
Oh, wow.
So that's one good example for you. Lucinda Duncan's grave becomes, and you may already know this, but it becomes a big landmark during the railroad era. Because the railroad comes in, erects this giant cross, and then they write it up in the guidebooks, and they also sometimes have live people on the trains pointing it out, like make sure you look at the window and honor this woman who they say is a young teenager, but but you all might know that too.
We'll go here in the front and then John.
Hi,
Hi.
2 questions. So when you had 3 or 4 quotes, I was surprised at the 3rd quote that used the term African American. I thought that term came much later. So that's one question.
Okay.
The other question was cremation not a thing at that point? Did cremation come later?
Yes, okay, good question. So the first question was about the use of African American, and I think that was in text that was preceding William Lloyd Garrison's quote. So I think I used that term when I was writing in the book, but then what was inside the quotes, I don't think used it. So they weren't using that at the time. Absolutely, great question. And then the second question was about when did cremation come around? Was that later? Yes, absolutely later. There's a huge emphasis in 19th century white Protestant culture is that you want to maintain the body as much as possible. So that's why Bruff's Fate of Many is so terrifying to people, that the physical remains of the dead will be disturbed. If they're disturbed, it might mean that when the resurrection comes, the person won't be whole or complete as they should be. Yeah.
John,
I was struck with 2 questions. Maybe the simplest one. You precisely said, beginning 6,600 deaths. How was that census achieved? Has this been a huge research and you're picking up the endless decades of research on the trail and they've been thoroughly done as a census? Is that
5,600.
So that's 6,600 is an estimate, and absolutely. So one of the things about this topic that's so wonderful is that there's all these wonderful primary sources, and there's also a wonderful plethora of research of folks who've dedicated decades of their lives to researching this. Richard Reek, who's a retired geographer and a trail historian, his focus has really been on trying to quantify the dead. And so I lean on his estimate. And I think he's probably right. He's gone into the material with such a fine-tooth comb. One of the things he's been really passionate about is parsing these sort of double grave phenomenon where, so like Sarah Nichols' son was brought home, but that was really exceptional. But when people couldn't have their dead brought home, they might still erect a grave in the local cemetery in Illinois. And so there's actually sort of like 2 graves. And so that's one of the things he's been sort of disconnecting that mythology from where they were actually buried. I think for my purposes, on some level, how many people died doesn't matter as much as the meaning that people made out of them. That every sort of like spot on the plains where some sort of rocks had been laid over that looked like a form of protection, people think there might be a body there. That kind of a thing. It's sort of this idea that they could be lost, and so they could be everywhere, and that makes the entire West sacred white space. But that's a really good question.
the other one would be, you have the map of showing the dispossession.
Yes,
On the West Coast,
yes.
there's no evidence though of the Mexican or the white thing as of 1850. It wasn't huge from the East Coast.
Yeah.
But there was a huge amount of Mexican wealth on the coast. There's no evidence in that map of the blue that like the Mexicans have come up in the last 70 to 80 years.
Oh, yeah, that's a
So
really
that's a
good
kind of,
point.
You know.
Yeah.
Clearly, they had been in possession of that
Right.
area, not fully. It was a mixed area.
1776.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
so a map that was very much then made from the US perspective, rather than acknowledging the varieties of colonialism that were already ongoing in our area before that. That's a really good
What I'm saying
point.
is the whole other thing of how many people came over the trail as opposed to came by sea.
Mhm.
California was really settled sea,
Yeah,
not
there,
other parts of the West.
yeah, absolutely. A lot of people do come by sea, and I forgot to repeat the second question, but it was really a astute comment about the map with the native homelands in blue, not recognizing the presence of Spanish and later Mexican colonizers, for instance. Or we could even say Russian, right? A
Well,
little
it's
bit.
very
Tiny bit. And then the other comment was about sort of, again, thinking through numbers and that a lot of people come overland, but even more people come by sea to the coast. Yeah, absolutely. There's something special about the overland journey. There's something special culturally. I made it across the continent. I made it by wagon. They say, you know, we're doing exactly what our forefathers did when they crossed the Appalachians. Absolutely. But you're right.
Any chance, is your family maybe connected to the overland?
Oh, yeah. 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 Yeah.
Way back.
Yeah. Way back. Yes, my family is connected to overland. That was the other question. Okay.
Yeah, and any other questions here? Yes.
Do you have numbers to compare how deadly the Overland Trail was compared to staying in the Northwest, East Coast, Southeast?
Yeah.
It seems as also a victim or beneficiary of the video game that it exaggerated. 'Cause,
Absolutely.
I mean, at least when I played, you know, 5 out of 5 dying before they reached Oregon was normal, and it can't be that high.
Right, right. Yeah, absolutely. That's a wonderful question. So the question is about, were you actually more likely to die if you took the trail? Like, not really. Like, cholera could get you anywhere, but it's extra scary that you might be sick and die on the trail. It's extra scary because you're away from home and families who would care for you, who would care for your body. And then it's extra scary because you're going to be left in this land that is foreign. Yeah, absolutely. So that's where it becomes bigger.
Great. And we had one more question back there.
You mentioned that it's harder to find Native American accounts.
Yes.
So I was wondering if there was any special sources that you came across while you were writing this that like contributed to your, quoting of their side of the story.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So the question is about source material and how I mentioned it's harder to find Native voices or sources written from the Native perspective. And I was really trying to focus on that in terms of the immigrant archive, because we know during the voluntary white westward migration, of course, they're meeting Indigenous peoples, right? But when there are these accounts, they're often very fleeting, and they're always written from the white perspective of these people who were really coached to write. This is what they did. They wrote to record this monumental event. But there are a fair amount of good sources, or at least more sources of Native peoples writing and speaking around these anti-removal campaigns, in part because political leaders had English language skills, also because they had white allies who helped them get published. And so that really became sort of my window into how they were talking about the same types of themes I was seeing in this later time period in a different place. Yeah, that's a really good question.
Well, we're at the top of the hour, so
Okay.
we're gonna wrap up. There are some questions on Zoom that I'm gonna share with you later because
Okay.
they come with some commentary. There's a little explanation and then a question.
Okay.
Some of them were partially addressed with some of the questions here.
Okay.
And if we can get back to some of those members, we can work on that together. That's
Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you have any final comments for the audience?
No, I
before
just
wrap up?
want to say thank you for being a wonderful audience and thank you for having me.
You can turn that off. Step in front of the camera and wrap up.
When is the next book coming?
No, but we do.
We do have, well, let's talk about this book first, because there was a question about this book. We don't have copies of this book here for folks. We have this one.
Yeah.
I don't know, and Sarah's, so she can decide if she's gonna sign it and sell it to you or what she's gonna do. We do have some cards. Jacob, and right behind you, there were some cards about the book. that talk more about the book and I think how to buy
And
it,
there's a
right?
discount.
And the
code.
discount code on it. So we can get you that after today. Great. And then Kathleen, you were asking about the next book?
Yeah, the next one. When is the next
When's your
book
next book
on
out?
file?
Oh,
Suffrage.
a long time.
Oh. To be determined. The next book
Research has to happen.
will be
Yes,
determined.
Gotta do the research.
So again, I'm going to wrap up and I'm going to ask you all to thank our speaker for this evening, Sarah Kais. And thank you for attending this book club program here in person or out there on Zoom. Please join us for our next program. We've got a couple of weeks off because we have a virtual community meeting and a holiday in there. The next in-person and virtual event will be September 16th at 6 o'clock. And the title is A Deep City Approach to Climate Change, the Case of Deep Oakland. And it's an in-person and virtual presentation by geologist and geoscience writer Andrew Alden here at the book club. You can register for that program or any program at the book club online at bccbooks.org/programs, or you can give me a call and I can register you for that, or you can just check out the website or whatever you want to do. There's also the email list newsletter that comes out, which always has a registration link for all of our programs. So you should be getting that from us. Thank you again for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful evening and we look forward to seeing you here at the book club again. Thank you.